Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. A lot of things to discuss. We'll start with the explosion in Israel following the passage of the judicial reform legislation by the Israeli Knesset with a vote of 64-0 because the opposition walked out when the vote happened. What are the implications of this change in how Israel is dealing with its checks and balances in a liberal democracy? And what does it mean for relations with the United States? Then we'll take a look at the summit meeting in St. Petersburg between President Putin and African leaders. Not as many showed up as he might have hoped, but nevertheless, the meeting is taking place in the background of a canceled grain deal, which the African leaders are not happy about. And then finally, elections in Spain over the weekend threatened to bring to power the far right, but it seems the center was holding with enough votes for both the Socialist Party, which is currently in government, and the mainstream center-right opposition party, the People's Party, to prevent, at least for now, a move to the right in Spain. Here to talk about these issues today are Elise Labott, who is founder and editor-in-chief of Zivvy Media, and Giles Whittell, world affairs editor at Tortoise Media. Elise, Giles, great to see both of you. Wonderful to have you. We were going to be joined by Ravi Agarwal, who unfortunately had to just jump out at the last minute, and we're just going to be the three of us. Just more time for all of us to chat about these important issues. Elise, let me start with you. A bombshell in Jerusalem with the Knesset passing a law that President Biden had said, please don't, take your time, build consensus. When hundreds of thousands are in the street and the Knesset passes a law without the opposition present, you have to ask, what does this say about the stability of the political system, the democracy in Israel? And what is the implication of a country that stands out as the lone democracy in the Middle East moving in this direction?
Right. Well, I mean, obviously, it was as expected that it would pass. I mean, I think that there was a hope, President Herzog, and obviously those warnings from President Biden that there should be some kind of negotiation. Those negotiations fell apart. The parliament passed a first bill, which basically ends the court's ability to strike down government decisions. Really, the Supreme Court in Israel is kind of the last bastion, and this was what this bill was called, of reasonableness, of reasonability. Basically, if there are political decisions, the court can say, that's not reasonable. And that was really what forced this law. But also, it's very important in terms of dealing with the Palestinians. This is one of the court certainly is a check and balance on the Israeli government in terms of the Palestinians and other issues. And so basically, as you said, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, but more importantly, thousands of reservists. The main union, workers' union in Israel, doctors, all threatening to go on strike. Reservists are already starting saying they won't report for duty. And, in a country where security is paramount, this is really one of the main, concerns of certainly of the security apparatus. But in terms of the larger democracy, basically, Israel has been, as you said, the only democracy really in the region. Certainly U.S. considers that, shared interests, shared values. And now there's a lot of questions about does the U.S. share the same values as Israel? Certainly not of this government right now. And so it has a lot of larger implications. But right now, the country is really in crisis.
Giles, when you hear Netanyahu himself and others in the coalition, they said, listen, we live in a democracy. We won the election. We're the majority party. We're implementing the wishes of our electorate. Don't in democracies the majorities rule? If people don't like what we are doing, they can vote in another government at another time and they can change it. What's wrong with that?
It's a good question, and it's an especially compelling one coming to this as outsiders. because there's a lot about this situation that on the face of it seems reasonable, to use the word of the moment. The critics of this reasonableness standard that is issue with the judicial reform say it's not a real legal standard. It's a linguistic construct. And you have to wonder, how subjective is this when it is actually applied? Also, a future stage in the judicial overhaul is said to be one that will formalize the Knesset's supremacy over the Supreme Court, and among other things would allow ministers to appoint legal advisors as political appointees. Now, all these things, from the UK perspective and probably from the US perspective as well, sound reasonable, but for certain key things. There is no upper house, as Elise was sort of intimating, in Israel, upper elected chambers. So the Supreme Court serves a very different purpose, and it's one behind which so many of the people in the streets seem to be rallying. I think it's also really important to remember that the reasonableness standard has been applied very reasonably. The history of the use of this standard is really interesting. I mean, reading into it early this week for Tortoise, it has been used by the Supreme Court, for example, to force the Israeli army to bring to justice troops legitimately accused of beating up Palestinian detainees. It's been used to force the prosecution of bankers accused of insider trading. It's been used, and this is key in terms of current politics, to keep out of office Aryeh Deri, one of Netanyahu's key allies on the hard right, to whom he is increasingly beholden if he wants to stay in power, because he's been convicted of fraud himself. So if the reasonableness standard had been abused by the Supreme Court, then you might have thought as an outsider that these were reasonable reform efforts by this government. But it hasn't been, I think, by any reasonable standard. And you have to remember that, again, by any reasonable standard, this is the most right-wing government in Israel 75 years.
Right.
Yeah,
and I
so,
think you... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I'll come back to you, Elise, but it seems, just to clarify a little bit, why this is such a big debate, it seems to me, other than in other places, is because, in contrast to the United States, or indeed in contrast to other parliamentary systems, with the exception, by the way, of the United Kingdom, there is really no check on the legislative and executive power, which, by the way, is one, because in a parliamentary system, it's the majority in the legislature that creates the executive. There is no written constitution, which otherwise would be open to interpretation by an independent court. And if the court's no longer able to overrule the Knesset on basic issues of reasonableness, there's no way to check the power of an executive. You have not just majority rule, but you have majority tyranny, which could, in some ways, change all kinds of laws, including electoral laws, and abandon elections. And so that is a big difference from what would happen in a country like the United States, which has both a written constitution and a separation of powers, and I think that may be part of what's going on here. But it does raise questions, Elise, about the nature of democracy in countries like this, and how to think about it.
Exactly. And could you imagine the U.S. amending its own constitution with no kind of real debate or attempt, to forge consensus? I mean, as Giles said, this is a very right-wing government. And and because the Supreme Court is really the only check and balance, they don't want that. The settlers in the coalition want the Supreme Court out of the way so they can create settlements and, really kind of take over Palestinian lands. The ultra-Orthodox in the coalition, there's a real debate about whether Orthodox have to serve in the military, and the Supreme Court is that they military service. And then, Netanyahu and his cronies want to be able to put whoever they want in the government. And, the Steri guy is a perfect example of that. And then there's the issue of Netanyahu himself, who is, on trial for fraud of his own and corruption of his own. And so, basically, they don't want any checks and balances at all. I don't know how, in the end, how true it would be, but Netanyahu thinks if he pushes this through the Supreme Court, he wouldn't have to stand on trial. And then there are some in his cabinet that are calling for the firing of the attorney general. And that would be something that the Supreme Court would say is unreasonable. And so it's really just an attempt to push through whatever they want. And this is really, the opposite of what a democracy is.
Giles, yeah.
Sorry, about crisis. Elise used the word crisis. It's overword, but it's absolutely right in the sort of technical sense here that you now have, and this leads us back to, we're talking about the structure of Israeli government. You now have the Supreme Court hearing appeals about its own powers. And so this is a circular argument in which you have a relatively substantial Knesset majority by Netanyahu's standards facing off against a Supreme Court. And it's a question of who blinks first, because for want of other checks and balances, branches of government, there is no one other than the Supreme Court to decide on its own powers. So it's a crisis in the strict sense that there's no mechanism to resolve it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Giles. And the real crisis, the real constitutional, if the Supreme Court rules that this law, which is, by the way, an amendment to the basic law, which the Supreme Court generally does not rule on, but if it were to rule and said, no, this is a violation of the reasonableness standard and therefore unconstitutional, the question arises: who's got the last say? The government, which need to be implementing the laws that were passed by the legislature, or the courts? Interestingly enough, the security services have indicated, including the head of Mossad, that for now, because in fact it's just a law in the books that has no implication, there is no constitutional crisis. But if there is, he would stand on the right of the constitutional right, implying he would side with the Supreme Court. So this is, as you said, Giles, a crisis, if not right now, certainly in the making, as the Constitutional Court rules, with really dire consequences for the relationship with the United States, with the rest of the world, where this is politically also becoming hot, Elise.
It's also becoming hot, but I think before we get to that, I mean, we really need to talk about, what is in danger in the country. I mean, basically military leaders are saying that the army itself, which is really considered a people's army, right? I mean, there's mandatory military service, but then after that, there's reservists, and that's a people's army. The Institute for National Security Studies, which is a big think tank with very close ties to the defense establishment, said that the army is in danger of dissolution. And, the chief of the IDF said that without a strong united defense force, Israel would no longer be able to exist as a country in the region. And you have, bad actors like Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, marking what's going on. A lot of these reservists are protecting the border between Israel and Lebanon. So yes, it would, obviously harm relations with the U.S., and we can get to that in a second. But it certainly would harm Israeli security. And then when you go on to the relationship with the U.S., I mean, the U.S. defends Israel in any bunch of situations, particularly at the United Nations, because it knows that the Supreme Court is always, checking what's, back to that word, reasonable or not. Does that bargain go away? That's what I think we really have to see. Is the U.S. going to stop defending Israel in international fora? We're not talking about the United States stopping to, make sure that Israel is defended, giving it military aid. We're not talking about any of that. But, a decision by the U.S. to stop, its full-throated unconditional diplomatic support of Israel would also be very
looks at Israel now with the same queasiness, and certainly under a likely future Labour administration from next year, as we've been looking at Hungary and Poland recently within the EU. And there is a what goes around comes around sense of this, because Netanyahu is regarded amongst populist right-wing leaders in the EU and perhaps in the US as well, as the grandfather of them all, as the pioneer of many of the tactics that have been used again, particularly by Viktor Orban in Hungary and by the Law and Justice Party, the ruling party in Poland. And there's a sense that having been trialed in the laboratory of Israel, used successfully to erode liberal democracy and turn it into illiberal democracy and create really existential problems for the EU, they've now come back to Israel, where they're being pushed to extremes, partly for self-interested reasons, perhaps mainly on the part of Netanyahu and his ministers. And the outpouring of public protest is very dramatic. One thing that, as a non-specialist, I'm not clear about is the extent to which the electorate, as well as Netanyahu's various coalitions, have been drifting to the right. One is clear, the other less so. And I'd be really interested to know what you guys feel about that.
Well, I think
Elise?
what's happening is the right. I think by and large, Israelis are very conservative on national security. But what Netanyahu has done is he has pushed the kind of right more to the center with all of these actions. And in effect, what he has to do is to go further to the right to put together this constellation of small fringe parties to maintain his coalition. I mean, you remember what happened with Lapid and Bennett putting together this government that finally got rid of him. He was able to come back by putting together this coalition of these smaller parties. And so, the smaller parties make up, a very small majority. But I think the more these actions are actually going to move Israel more to the center and even to the center left. Eva, what do you think?
I think. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, the only way he could make this coalition work is to bring in parties he was unwilling to bring into the coalition beforehand, that were so far beholden to them, and now he's beholden to it. It's strange to think, but Netanyahu is the left wing of his coalition, which is a different way of looking at this, and it just goes to the deep division and polarization within Israeli society between a sort of nationalist, ultra-religious right and a secular, more pluralistic left or center left in the country, and we're seeing it playing out now in this constitutional debate and ultimately constitutional crisis. We'll be back on this issue, but Elise, I just wanted one other question on related to this. Very interesting story in today's New York Times by Tom Friedman, who in the last couple of weeks has been writing a lot about this. Of course, it's his whole bailiwick. He had a meeting with President Biden in the Oval Office about these issues, which he wrote about in his previous column. In this column, he wrote about visits by Jake Sullivan to Saudi Arabia, trying to see if there may be some really, really big deal that is coming on the heels of this vote, and the timing is kind of interesting. Describe the deal that the U.S. is looking for, and sort of what do you think about its chances?
So, I mean, this would be an extension of the Abraham Accords that President Trump set between normalizing relations between Israel and then Bahrain, the UAE, Morocco, and Sudan. And the Biden administration has been trying to pick that up and run with it. And Saudi would be, the linchpin of the Abraham Accords, and would it be able to kind of best Trump? And so Biden has been trying to get this deal for normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. He's already been able to kind of negotiate some small little coups, if you will. There's been air flights over Israeli air flights over Saudi airspace. There's been some other small agreements. The Saudis now are allowing Israelis to visit for certain meetings. But this would be a big security deal where essentially the U.S. gives Saudi a lot of things in order for Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel. So the Saudis are seeking pretty much more from Washington, kind of a NATO type security agreement that would force the United States to come to Saudi's offense if it is attacked, most likely by Iran, a civilian nuclear program that would, monitored by the United States, and, more weapons, more anti-ballistic missile systems that, again, would be helpful against Iran. They're all also looking for, and this would be, I think, the main thing that they wouldn't be able to do without is something for the Palestinians, something major for the Palestinians that they can say it was worth their while, and they could claim to the Muslim world as leader of the Muslim world that this was worth it, kind of like the UAE did when it said that it wouldn't have, extension of the West Bank by Israel. We don't know how permanent that is. But the Saudis would need something significant. And my understanding is that's really, even though that's maybe not what they really want, that's really what they need in order to close this deal. And then the U.S. is looking for an end to the fighting in Yemen, basically some aid for the Palestinians, but also a curbing on the relations between Saudi Arabia and China. You've seen Saudi Arabia and China cozying up. There's been a lot of oil deals. There's been talk about tying, oil sales to Chinese currency. The U.S. wants to nip that in the bud. And so if they can do both at the same time, Biden would be able to claim this as a win. It's, we could talk more about it. It's a little bit curious timing, but it just goes to show that the Israel's security is really paramount as opposed to the diplomatic part.
Yeah, no, it's just fascinating that these two things are happening at the same time, because clearly the one thing that Netanyahu and Israel, this is not a political issue, this is where the consensus would like more than anything else, is to have peace with its neighbors. And the core of those neighbors, of course, the Saudis, who in 1982 said there would be no normalization of relations without the resolution of the Palestinian issue. And since there is no resolution of the Palestinian issue, that still is outstanding. But Giles, how do you look at this reporting of at least an attempt to try to get a deal like this? Clearly a big deal if it were to ever happen, but a lot of ifs.
Friedman is very confident in his reporting that this would be, in a sense, an easy sell for Israel, despite the fact that it would require them probably to pull back on settlements on the West Bank and abandon the hopes, which are formal hopes on the part of right-wing members of the Netanyahu coalition, for full annexation of the West Bank. I'm not honestly quite clear how it's very clear in this deal what's in it for the US, be tremendous foreign policy coup for Biden. What's in it for Saudi? Security, and the kudos of being a strategic, having the strategic alliance with the US beefed up in this way. I'm not clear how it's such a straightforward step to bind Israel into it, given the current drift of the administration, and that clearly, even if it's only a collection of hard right parties, they're committed to a different agenda.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be.
The coalition could fall apart just on that.
Well, that might be not such a bad idea for
and the goal.
And the globe, exactly. So, well, we've been watching it closely. Interesting stuff, no doubt. Let's switch over to the meeting in St. Petersburg, which is concluding today. It was supposed to be a 4-day meeting. It's a 2-day meeting between Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and African counterparts. As it turned out, only only about 17 African leaders out of the 56 showed up. That's way less than half than 4 years ago, when some 45 leaders showed up. And it seems to be the big issue, not surprisingly, is the suspension of the grain deal that Russia had with Ukraine, negotiated on the auspices of the Turks and the United Nations, which is raising grain prices, which is the one thing that the Africans, of course, are most upset about, quite apart from the fact that the Russians don't have much to offer on the things they care most about, like financing of climate change and infrastructure development. Giles, strange timing for the meeting, although presumably it's been on a sort of cadence, comes on the heels of Vladimir Putin saying that he's not going to South Africa for a summit next month of the BRICS, because the South Africans might have to arrest him, since he's been there's an arrest warrant out for his arrest by the International Criminal Court. How should we look at both the meeting and what the African leaders are hoping to get out of it?
Well, on the timing, as you suggest, this is long planned. It would have been even more embarrassing for Russia to scrap it all together. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been making multiple trips to sub-Saharan Africa to carry support for the meeting in advance. 6 months ago, Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, was saying in public and private, do not underestimate the resentment that the Global South feels when ordered by the rich West to fall into line on Ukraine. Now, I think it's more a case of do not overestimate the resentment on the part of the Global South about falling into line with the West on Ukraine. As you say, a key factor here is Russia's resiling from the grain deal, threatening a new blockade of Black Sea ports, and thereby directly denying critical grain supplies, principally to the Horn of Africa, which of course needs them most because it can grow least. And Kenya, which is the linchpin power in the Horn of Africa, is one of the key no-shows in St. Petersburg. Nigeria from West Africa, also a no-show. And as you point out, Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa has said that Putin is not, after all, going to come to the BRICS summit later on. I mean, this is an extraordinary summit that shows, in addition to those factors which are practical and logistical and to do with hunger, I think that African leaders have seen over the course of the past 17, 18 months, that there is only one right side to be on in this issue. They are probably also aware that while Russia has worked hard to increase its profile across the continent with the Wagner group of mercenaries, with the kind of low-cost, high-impact, as it's been said, Russian approach to African relations, targeting elites, controlling elites, making elites comfortable, they remain minnows in the foreign direct investment and aid business. I was very struck by these statistics which The Economist reported. Just 2% of foreign direct investment into Africa is Russian. And I don't usually carry water for the UK on this, on any issues, but if you look at actual humanitarian aid, the scale of Russian aid to Africa is 1/100th of UK aid, which of course is itself much smaller than US aid. So I think when they really look at the balance sheets, African leaders have been thinking there are moral reasons and there are also very practical reasons to get on the right side of the Ukraine issue and not to show up at St. Petersburg. Just one other point, two people who have shown up, Victor Bout, the Lord of War, the infamous arms dealer, and Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, who by rights should have been, under the normal rules of Putinism, locked up or executed by now. But Putin is so short of friends that they have leading roles at this very strange summit, which is not surprising, I think, has been curtailed by 2 days.
Elise, I was going to ask you on both your point of view on sort of this meeting, but the weirdest guest of all being Prigozhin, who was supposed to be in exile in Belarus, although he's also having tea apparently in the Kremlin with Vladimir Putin at times, showing up at this summit and meeting with these African leaders. By the way, many of whom he's meeting with, all of whom he's meeting with, are fully dependent on Wagner, the group that he still leads, or at least ostensibly still leads, for remaining in power. That's true for the Central African Republic. It's true for others. And so really strange given the background that just a month ago, really literally a month ago, this Prigozhin was leading a mutiny and driving tanks up to Moscow.
Well, I mean, I think it just goes to show. I think it just goes to show how diplomatically isolated and how, as Giles said, how few friends Putin has. That basically, I won't say it's bygones be bygones with Prigozhin, but he needs Prigozhin, and especially in Africa where Wagner is super powerful, and a lot of these countries rely on him. I mean, his presence at the meeting, is not just significant for us watching it, but it's significant for the African leaders. I mean, they would need to see him there and need to see that, they can still depend on Wagner and Putin for their security. I also think, the African countries are in, a kind of catch-22. Traditionally, Africa has been a non-aligned, region. They don't want to, over rely on the West. They don't want to over rely on Russia. But I think, you saw, when Blinken went there last year, especially in South Africa, they, the minister the foreign minister was complaining about like this patronizing, like, don't assume that we're going to side with you. But I think when you look at, they're going to be on the right side of this for their own reasons. And I think more and more countries are starting to be on the right side of the Ukraine issue. Only two, I think, Eritrea and Mali voted in support of Putin at the United Nations. Most of them abstained. Several, I think 9 of them or so. About 19 African states have voted with Ukraine at least once. They kind of change according to the resolution. But I don't think either side has really captured, the Africans. Right now, Putin is trying to, save grace after the grain deal, saying, to states that are supportive of him now. He's not saying it to all the African states. He's saying, we'll give you grain. We can more than manage your needs. And by the way, Ukraine, this was just a propaganda. You really weren't getting Ukrainian grain. You were getting Russian grain to begin with. I mean, the Russian propaganda machine is very big. It's very potent, particularly in Francophone Africa. And so he's trying to create the narrative that he'll be able to take care of, again, the countries that are going to support him. But I don't think the West can take the Africans for granted. And clearly with the showing that you saw in St. Petersburg, Putin can't take Russia as Africa as a continent for granted either.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points. I mean, on the grain, the free grain that is being promised to these countries is grain that
not free. It's
well, no, the Russians are stealing it from the Ukrainians to start off with, as they have done all along, and it sort of undermines his argument that one of the reasons he walked away from the grain deal is said, well, we're not allowed to export our own grain. Well, actually, that's not true. You have been exporting your own grain and fertilizers, and they're not under sanction either. But the larger point that both of you, I think, rightly bring up is the world is not divided between good guys and bad guys. It's not divided. Are you with us? Are you against us? That's a period that, frankly, if it ever existed, doesn't exist anymore. And all countries are trying to advance their own interest. And if you are in Africa, you have your own interest, you want to pursue them. You're going to try to do that with by playing off the Russians and the Americans and the Chinese and the EU to the best of your ability. And And I think that's what we're seeing here. Clearly, I think Elise was right. Don't patronize us. It's not what we want. But make the case for why you think what you're trying to get from us is the right thing to do, and then in turn listen to what we need from you, which is something that, frankly, Washington and Brussels and Beijing and Moscow are well to take up themselves. Giles.
One final point on this. It's a practical one. It's worth noting that if Russian grain blockade takes effect, its effect could be very serious indeed. We're all aware of the effects of climate change on wheat yields all over the world, on famine in importing countries that have traditionally imported Russian grain. A curious feature of the war and the grain deal itself is that over the past year, from the year from when the grain deal was signed until now, more Ukrainian grain was exported than in the previous year. So we have no idea yet what the world looks like when that grain supply is really shut off. If that happens, it could be very serious indeed.
Yeah, important as part of that more than half of the Ukrainian grain actually made its way onto world markets, not through the Black Sea, but through other means, right. Which of course remain open through the Danube and other places. Worth watching. Giles, last issue, the elections in Spain. They didn't come out the way the polls were predicting, or at least many were suggesting. Came out in a total muddle, but in sometimes muddle is good, or at least the center for the center. Just bring us up to date about where that election ended up and how we should read it.
Yeah, I was reminded of this when Elise was talking about the idea of Netanyahu possibly ultimately pushing the right to the center in Israel. Well, so this was the election in which Vox, the hard right party in Spain, was supposed to become the first hard right party to taste power in Spain since the end of fascism in Spain in 1975. And it didn't work out like that because Vox's own vote collapsed. The socialists under the incumbent Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez did surprisingly well. And he now clings on, trying to form a new coalition with a better chance of doing so than his counterparts on the right, even though the socialists, his party, are no longer the single biggest party in the Spanish parliament. There are a number of reasons why this has happened. Firstly, the economy in Spain has been doing surprisingly well over the past year or so. The effects of climate change on key industries like olive oil and tourism notwithstanding. And I think a key point, though, is the collapse in Vox's vote in the election. And this turns out to have been because it harnessed a wave of centre-right and right-wing anger starting in about 2017 over the separatist tendencies, principally of Catalonia. There's a broad right and centre-right sense that Spain needs at all costs to survive as a unitary state. If the conventional centre-left and centre-right parties weren't going to ensure that, then they would lend their support to a party that unashamedly was committed to stamping out Catalan separatism at all costs. And that party was Vox. But what's happened instead is that in the final month leading up to the election, Vox's support in polling fell off. The support for Sanchez's socialists grew dramatically. And I'm told that one reason for that is that 2 months prior, in local elections, both the People's Party, which is the mainstream centre-right party, and Vox underperformed. And so the Spanish centre-right realized that if they were to return to power, if Sanchez's coalition were to be booted out, it would only be in coalition with Vox. And there are residual concerns amongst moderate Spanish conservatives to do with Vox's embrace of the flag, of nationalism as opposed to patriotism, on which we're running out of time, but a very quick story. In Seville, at this time of year, they have a festival called La Cucaña. My son is there, and he's sent me a video clip. It involves men in swimming shorts running out over the water along a bowsprit, a pole attached to an old sailing ship, covered in thick grease. And the idea is to run all the way up the pole and get the Spanish flag at the end, right? My son actually only got a few feet, but the practice ones, they try very hard to get all the way there. None of them ever get the flag. And I see this as a sort of a parable about Spain's conflicted approach to their own nationhood and flag. Anyway, long story short, Vox chronically underperformed. They only have 170 when they need 172 MPs to form a coalition. It looks very much as if either they won't, or Spain will have to go back to the polls in due course if Sanchez fails to form a coalition. He is meanwhile engaged in trying to create one with the help, controversially, of separatist parties. But in broader terms, what this means is that the sort of wave of patriotic right-wing parties that Giorgia Meloni, among others in Italy, predicted simply hasn't come to pass.
Yeah, I think Giles did excellent sort of overview of what happened, and I actually thought it had to do with Carlos Alcaraz beating Djokovic in Wimbledon, but probably not.
I don't think the timing was quite right there, was it?
Yeah. Well, a new patriotism. Well, no, new patriotism, as opposed to in that sense. But at least there is this larger piece, right, which is where Giles ended. There was this fear within the EU and other places that having the far right come to power in Spain after what has happened in Italy, although not, by the way, in Greece, where the center right not only won but won hugely and staved off any idea of a coalition with the further right. There's this worry. They have in Germany, the AfD is now the second largest party in opinion polls, that the right is ascendant in Europe, and yet when voters go to the polls, they tend to fall short.
That's right. I mean, look, there's a sigh of relief across Europe, and I think in the United States that, this far right movement making gains in Sweden, Finland, Germany, Greece, as you said, France, Italy, and also here in the United States. I mean, these are very hard right nationalist views, opposition to migration, opposition to LGBT rights, assertion of nationalism. And, here in the United States, they're comparing it to like the Ron DeSantis, targeting illiberal thought wherever it is, banning the LGBT flag, talking about giving parents more rights to determine what their children should be reading, books they should be reading. And so I think there's this sigh of relief that, yes, this is an ascendant movement, but in the end, a more moderate public prevails. But it's certainly something to watch. And I think, as we saw in the election with President Trump, if the concerns of these, right-wing voters are not addressed, they're going to get even more ascendant. So, you can breathe your sigh of relief, but you can't really take your eye off the ball, because these concerns are going to only grow if they're not addressed. And I think that's what we saw with the election of President Trump.
Yeah, it's certainly, I think, a good warning that these policies are responding to at least parts of the electorate that really need them, and other places. Though, let me end with this anecdote. It is the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Party spoke to the African leaders about their common views about the decadent West, which had embraced gender changes and all kinds of things that were horrific. And you do have this sense that the Russian right, now embraced by the Orthodox Church, and parts of the European and indeed American right are all in the same place. And you do wonder what that tells us about the future. Elise Labott, Giles Whittell, thanks so much for really an excellent conversation, broad-ranging, lots of insight. That's what we hope to get every Friday. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. We'll be back next Friday with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.